As you settle comfortably and prepare to drift into sleep, let me tell you the story of one of history's most peculiar conflicts, a war that began because of a simple wooden bucket. Yes, a humble bucket, the kind you might use to draw water from a well, became the unlikely catalyst for bloodshed between two Italian city states in the Middle Ages. Our story takes us to northern Italy in the early 14th century. This was a time when Italy was not the unified country we know today, but rather a patchwork of independent city states, each with their own governments, armies, and fierce civic pride. Among these were Bologna and Modena, two neighboring cities separated by merely 25 miles, yet divided by deep-seated rivalries and political differences. Bologna was aligned with the Guelphs, who supported the Pope, while Modena sided with the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. This political divide was common throughout medieval Italy, creating a landscape where tensions constantly simmered beneath the surface. The two factions had been engaged in a complex dance of alliances and conflicts for generations. The year was 1325. The summer heat lay heavy across the Po Valley, and relations between Bologna and Modena were particularly strained. It was against this backdrop that a group of Modenese soldiers ventured into Bologna on a seemingly absurd mission to steal a bucket from a public well in the city center. Why would armed men risk their lives for such a mundane object? Some historians suggest it was a deliberate provocation, a symbolic act of defiance. Others believe it was simply an impulsive act of mischief that spiraled out of control. Whatever the motivation, the Modenese soldiers successfully absconded with the wooden bucket, carrying it back to their city as a trophy of their daring raid. To modern ears, this might sound like a trivial matter, hardly worth noting, let alone fighting over. But in the context of medieval Italian politics and the intense rivalries between city-states, this theft was perceived as a grievous insult to Bolognese honor. The bucket itself held little material value, but its symbolic importance was immeasurable. It represented civic pride, territorial integrity, and the ability of a city to protect even its most humble possessions. The leaders of Bologna, outraged by this brazen act, demanded the immediate return of their property. The Modenese, perhaps amused by the reaction they had provoked, refused. This refusal transformed what might have been a minor incident into a serious diplomatic crisis. Messengers traveled back and forth between the cities, carrying increasingly heated demands and refusals. As days passed without resolution, the Bolognese authorities decided to take more drastic action. They raised an army of 30,000 soldiers, an impressive force for a medieval city-state, and prepared to march on Modena. Their stated goal was simple: recover the stolen bucket and punish those who had insulted their city's honor. The Modenese, learning of these preparations, were faced with a choice: return the bucket and make amends, or prepare for war. They chose the latter, assembling their own army of 5,000 men. Though significantly outnumbered, they were determined to defend their city, and perhaps more importantly, to keep their stolen prize. On November 15th, 1325, the two armies met at Zappolino, in territory belonging to Bologna. The Battle of Zappolino, as it came to be known, was surprisingly one-sided. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the Modenese forces were better trained and led, and they secured a decisive victory. The Bolognese army was routed, suffering significant casualties, before retreating back to the safety of their city walls. The victorious Modenese pursued them, reaching the outskirts of Bologna. There, in a final act of humiliation, they staged a mock tournament outside the city gates, within view of the defeated Bolognese. Unable to launch a counterattack, the people of Bologna could only watch this display of Modenese triumph from their walls. As a further insult, the Modenese soldiers seized another bucket from a well outside Bologna's walls before returning home. Now they had two buckets to display as symbols of their victory over their larger neighbor. The War of the Bucket, as this conflict came to be known, was brief but bloody. While it lasted only a couple of weeks, hundreds of lives were lost, all because of a simple wooden pail. Yet, as is often the case in history, the bucket was merely the spark that ignited existing tensions. The underlying causes were the complex political rivalries of medieval Italy, territorial disputes, and the intense competition between neighboring city-states. The stolen bucket itself survived the conflict and can still be seen today. It is preserved in the Torre della Ghirlandina, the bell tower of Modena Cathedral, where it has remained for nearly 700 years, a humble wooden artifact that triggered not-so-humble events. The peace that followed the War of the Bucket was uneasy and temporary. Bologna and Modena would continue their rivalry for centuries, with occasional flare-ups of violence. The bucket became a symbol of their enduring antagonism, a physical reminder of how seemingly insignificant objects can become imbued with profound significance in the context of human conflict. As you drift toward sleep, consider the strange irony of this historical episode. A simple bucket designed to carry life-giving water instead became associated with bloodshed. It reminds us that war can arise from the most unexpected sources, and that human pride and honor often attach themselves to the most ordinary objects. The story of the War of the Bucket also invites us to reflect on the nature of conflict itself. How often do we, like the citizens of Bologna and Modena, allow minor provocations to escalate into major disputes? How easily can symbolic offenses lead us down paths of mutual destruction? In the quiet darkness, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to wander, imagine that wooden bucket, weathered by time yet still intact, resting in its glass case in Modena. It has witnessed nearly 7 centuries of human history since the conflict it inadvertently sparked: plagues and Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, and World Wars, all the way to our modern era. The War of the Bucket may seem absurd to us now, a historical curiosity that brings a bemused smile rather than serious contemplation. Yet perhaps there is wisdom in that smile, a recognition of the human tendency to make mountains out of molehills, to transform simple objects into symbols worth fighting for. As we conclude this first chapter of our exploration into history's strangest conflicts, remember that the line between trivial and significant is often drawn by nothing more than perception. The bucket was just a bucket until people decided it was something more, a symbol of honor, an excuse for settling old scores, a pretext for expressing deeper animosities. In our next chapter, we will explore another peculiar conflict, one that began with a human ear rather than a wooden bucket. But that is a story for another night, as you now allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, letting the currents of sleep gradually carry you away into dreams, perhaps of medieval Italy and a humble bucket that changed the course of history for 2 proud cities. Rest peacefully, knowing that the bucket of Modena remains safely in its tower, no longer a cause for conflict, but merely a curious footnote in the long and often strange story of human warfare. Let us now turn our attention to another curious conflict, one that began with a severed human ear. This strange episode in history took place in the 18th century during an era of intense colonial rivalry between two of Europe's greatest powers, Great Britain and Spain. The story begins in 1731 off the coast of Florida, which was then under Spanish control. Robert Jenkins, captain of the British merchant ship Rebecca, was sailing in waters that Spain claimed as its exclusive territory. Spanish authorities were particularly concerned about British ships engaging in smuggling and illegal trade in their American colonies. A Spanish patrol boat commanded by Juan de Leon Fandino intercepted Jenkins' vessel. The Spanish Coast Guard boarded the Rebecca, searching for contraband goods. Finding what they considered evidence of smuggling, they proceeded to loot the ship. But Captain Fandino did not stop at merely confiscating goods. In an act of deliberate humiliation, he cut off one of Captain Jenkins's ears. According to varying accounts, Fandino handed the severed ear back to Jenkins with the contemptuous message, "Take this to your king and tell him that if he were present, I would do the same to him." Other versions suggest he said, "Go and tell your king that I will do the same to him if he dares to do the same as you." Regardless of the exact words, the intent was clear. This was not just an assault on a single British captain, but a symbolic challenge to British authority in the region. Captain Jenkins preserved his severed ear, possibly in a jar of spirits, and returned to England. The incident, while certainly traumatic for Jenkins, initially caused little stir in British political circles. Indeed, for several years, it appeared this would remain a private injury without broader consequences. However, by 1738, the political climate had changed significantly. Tensions between Britain and Spain had been growing over various trade and territorial disputes in the Caribbean and North America. British merchants were increasingly frustrated by Spanish restrictions on their trade with Spanish colonies, while Spain was concerned about British encroachment on territories they considered their own. British Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who had long preferred diplomatic solutions to military confrontation, was facing mounting pressure from the opposition. Led by figures such as William Pitt the Elder, this war party advocated for a more aggressive stance against Spain, particularly in defense of British trading interests. It was in this charged atmosphere that Jenkins's ear suddenly became politically useful. In March 1738, 7 years after the original incident, Captain Jenkins was summoned to appear before a committee of the House of Commons. There, he reportedly displayed his preserved ear and recounted his story of Spanish brutality. The timing of this display was not coincidental. The opposition used Jenkins' mutilation as vivid propaganda to arouse public outrage against Spain and to criticize Walpole's perceived passivity. The British press seized upon the story, embellishing it in patriotic fervor. The public imagination was captured by this tangible evidence of foreign insult to British honor and navigational rights. Walpole, despite his personal reluctance to go to war, found himself unable to resist the tide of public and parliamentary opinion. In October 1739, Britain formally declared war on Spain. The conflict that followed would come to be known, somewhat mockingly, as the War of Jenkins Ear. What began as a singular act of violence against one captain had escalated into a full scale colonial war. British forces attacked Spanish possessions in the Caribbean and the Americas. Admiral Edward Vernon led a successful assault on Portobello in Panama in November 1739, capturing this important Spanish trading port with just 6 ships, a victory that was celebrated wildly in Britain. However, the initial success was not sustained. Vernon's subsequent attempt to capture Cartagena in present day Colombia ended in disaster in 1741. The British forces, including colonial troops from North America, were decimated not primarily by Spanish resistance, but by disease. Yellow fever and other tropical illnesses claimed thousands of lives, with as many as 90% of the colonial troops perishing. The war gradually merged into the larger conflict known as the War of the Austrian Succession, which involved most of the European powers. By 1748, when the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle brought the broader European conflict to a close, the specific issues that had triggered the War of Jenkins Ear remained largely unresolved. Britain had failed to break Spain's control over its American empire, and Spain had been unable to end British trading activities in the region. Perhaps the most enduring question about this conflict concerns Jenkins's ear itself. Some historians have expressed skepticism about certain elements of the story. Was the ear really preserved for 7 years? Did Jenkins actually produce it before Parliament? Some accounts suggest he did show his severed ear, while others claim he merely displayed his scarred head. There are even those who question whether Jenkins lost his ear to the Spanish at all. What is clear, however, is that whether the physical ear was present or not, the story itself served its political purpose. It provided a simple, emotionally resonant symbol that could unite British public opinion against Spain. Complex diplomatic and economic issues were reduced to a visceral image, a loyal British subject mutilated by a foreign power. The War of Jenkins Ear illustrates how personal injury can become political instrument. Jenkins himself was not an important historical figure. He was a merchant captain who found himself unwittingly at the center of international politics. His ear, whether physically preserved or merely remembered, became a symbol far more significant than the man himself. This curious episode also demonstrates how nations often needed compelling narratives to justify going to war. Raw economic interests or abstract principles may not be enough to mobilize public support, but a story of personal suffering, especially one with a tangible relic, like a severed ear, can transform complex international relations into a simple tale of justice and retribution. For the thousands of sailors and soldiers who died in the jungles and seas of the Caribbean, the causes of the war were likely remote concerns. They fought and died far from home in a conflict that began at least nominally because of one man's ear. The war they experienced had little to do with Robert Jenkins' personal injury and everything to do with the imperial ambitions of competing European powers. The narrative of Jenkins' Ear continues to resonate as a historical curiosity, a reminder of how the personal and the political can become bizarrely intertwined. It stands alongside our wooden bucket from the previous chapter as evidence that the pretexts for war are sometimes far removed from the underlying causes, that symbolic injuries can trigger very real bloodshed. As we reflect on this strange chapter of history, we can appreciate the irony that while the name War of Jenkins Ear was originally used somewhat mockingly, it has become the conflict's enduring title. The ear that was meant to be forgotten has instead been remembered for centuries, outliving both the captain who lost it and the empires that fought over it. In our next chapter, we will move forward in time to the 20th century to explore how the world's most popular sport, football, became the unlikely spark for armed conflict between two Central American nations. But for now, let these thoughts of wooden buckets and severed ears slowly fade as more peaceful images take their place in your gradually drifting mind. From medieval buckets and 18th century ears, we now move to the 20th century, where we encounter perhaps one of the most unusual conflicts in modern history, a war that apparently began because of a football match. Known variously as the Football War, the Soccer War, or the 100 Hours War, this brief but intense conflict between Honduras and El Salvador in 1969 demonstrates how sporting events can amplify existing tensions between nations. The summer of 1969 found Honduras and El Salvador, two small Central American neighbors, preparing for a crucial series of football matches. These weren't just any games. They were qualifying matches for the 1970 FIFA World Cup to be held in Mexico. Football, known as soccer in North America, was and remains a source of immense national pride throughout Latin America. Success or failure in international competition often becomes intertwined with national identity itself. The first match took place in the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa on June 8th. The home team won by a single goal, sending the Honduran population into jubilant celebration. Salvadoran fans, however, did not take the defeat lightly. Reports indicate that a Salvadoran woman named Amelia Bolaños was so distraught by her national team's loss that she shot herself in the heart. Her suicide became national news in El Salvador, with the government organizing a televised funeral that was attended by the president himself, transforming Bolaños into a symbol of national honor. The second match, played a week later in San Salvador, took place in an atmosphere of intense hostility. The Honduran team was subjected to harassment throughout the night before the game, with fans gathering outside their hotel, honking horns, breaking windows, and throwing rotten eggs and dead rats to prevent the players from sleeping. When the team arrived at the stadium, they were transported in armored cars for their protection. The Honduran flag was burned, and a dirty rag was raised in its place. In this charged atmosphere, El Salvador won the match 2-0, evening the series and setting up a decisive third game. By now, violence had spilled beyond the stadium. Hondurans living in El Salvador were attacked, their businesses vandalized. This triggered retaliatory violence against Salvadorans living in Honduras, many of whom fled back across the border. The decisive playoff match took place on neutral ground in Mexico City on June 27th. El Salvador won 3-2 in extra time, qualifying for the World Cup. But by this point, the situation between the two countries had deteriorated well beyond a sporting rivalry. The day after the match, El Salvador severed diplomatic relations with Honduras. 2 weeks later, on July 14th, Salvadoran forces launched an attack across the border. The football war had begun. But was this really a war about football? The reality, as is often the case, was far more complex. The football matches did not cause the war. They merely served as the catalyst that brought long simmering tensions to a boil. The deeper roots of the conflict lay in socio-economic issues, particularly land reform and immigration. Honduras, though physically larger than El Salvador, was less densely populated. Over the preceding decades, approximately 300,000 Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras in search of land and work, primarily as agricultural laborers. This immigration created increasing resentment among Hondurans, who viewed the Salvadorans as taking their jobs and land. In 1969, the Honduran government had begun implementing an agrarian reform law that redistributed land to Honduran peasants, land that was often occupied by Salvadoran immigrants. Many Salvadorans were expelled from their farms and forced to return to El Salvador, a country that was already struggling with overpopulation and limited arable land. The Salvadoran government found itself facing a mounting crisis as thousands of displaced citizens returned, unable to absorb them economically. Against this backdrop, the football matches became more than sporting events. They became symbolic expressions of national pride and a focal point for existing animosities. The alleged suicide of Amelia Bolaños, whether it actually occurred as reported or was embellished for propaganda purposes, served to further inflame national passions and create a narrative of wounded honor that required vindication. The war itself, while brief, was anything but trivial. The Salvadoran army launched offensives along the main road connecting the two countries and captured some Honduran territory. The Honduran Air Force responded by bombing Salvadoran oil facilities and airfields. The fighting was fierce, with both sides employing World War II-era aircraft and weapons. After only 4 days, approximately 100 hours, the Organization of American States managed to negotiate a ceasefire. By that point, between 1,000 and 2,000 people had been killed, with many more wounded. Economic damage was estimated in the millions of dollars, and the Central American Common Market, a regional trade agreement, had been effectively destroyed. The ceasefire did not immediately resolve the border disputes that had contributed to the conflict. Those would remain unsettled until a final peace treaty was signed in 1980, more than a decade later. Meanwhile, thousands of Salvadorans remained displaced, unable to return to their former homes in Honduras. The football war provides a compelling example of how sporting events can become intertwined with politics and national identity. Football matches did not create the underlying conditions for war, but they provided a public, emotionally charged arena in which national rivalries could be enacted and inflamed. The games became a stage for expressing deeper conflicts related to land, immigration, economic opportunity, and sovereignty. The role of media in amplifying tensions cannot be overlooked. The extensive coverage of the alleged suicide of Amelia Bolaños, the nationalistic rhetoric in newspapers, and the public statements by political leaders all contributed to an atmosphere where rational diplomacy became increasingly difficult. The football matches were transformed from sporting events into symbolic battles, with victory or defeat carrying significance far beyond the normal stakes of athletic competition. There is perhaps something distinctly modern about the football war. While medieval conflicts might erupt over stolen buckets, and 18th century colonial disputes might focus on severed ears, it seems fitting that a 20th century conflict would center on the world's most popular sport. As societies became more connected through mass media, shared cultural experiences, like sporting events, gained greater power to unite or divide populations. The football war also reminds us that seemingly trivial events can become turning points in history when they intersect with existing tensions. The matches themselves did not cause the war, but they created a moment when long standing grievances could no longer be contained through normal diplomatic channels. Like a spark falling on dry tinder, the football rivalry ignited materials that were already primed to burn. The term football war itself is somewhat misleading, suggesting a conflict fought over a game. Some historians prefer the term Hundred Hours War, which at least avoids this mischaracterization. Yet the popular name persists, perhaps because it captures the strange incongruity of a modern war connected, however tangentially, to a sporting event. For the citizens of Honduras and El Salvador, the consequences of this brief war were all too real. Families were displaced, lives were lost, and regional economic cooperation was set back by years. The trappings of modern sports, stadiums, team colors, national anthems played before games, created an atmosphere of ritual combat that somehow transformed into actual combat, with bombs and bullets replacing balls and referees' whistles. As we reflect on this peculiar chapter in modern history, we might consider how national identity becomes invested in symbols and performances, how public spectacles can channel private resentments, and how the line between metaphorical and literal conflict can sometimes blur in unexpected ways. In our next chapter, we will cross the Pacific to explore how the death of a pig led to a tense military standoff between two of the world's greatest powers in what became known as the Pig War. But for now, let these thoughts of football rivalries and border disputes gradually recede, replaced by gentler, more peaceful images as your mind continues its journey toward restful slumber. From a conflict sparked by football matches, we now turn to a curious international incident that began with the death of a single pig. This strange episode occurred in the mid 19th century in a remote corner of North America where ambiguous treaty language had created a territorial dispute between the United States and Great Britain. The year was 1859. The place was San Juan Island, one of the islands in the archipelago that lies between Vancouver Island and the mainland of what is now Washington State. At the time, both the United States and Great Britain claimed sovereignty over these islands. The border between British-controlled Canada and the United States had been established by the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which stated that the boundary would follow the middle of the channel, separating the mainland from Vancouver Island. The problem was that there were two possible channels, the Haro Strait and the Rosario Strait, with the San Juan Islands lying between them. Britain claimed that the boundary should run through the Rosario Strait, placing the islands under British control, while the United States insisted that the Haro Strait was the correct boundary, which would make the islands American territory. For several years, both nations maintained an uneasy dual presence on San Juan Island. The Hudson's Bay Company, a British commercial enterprise, operated a sheep ranch on the island, while American settlers had begun to establish farms. The two groups coexisted in relative peace, despite their conflicting claims to the land. This peaceful coexistence was shattered on June 15th, 1859, when an American farmer named Lyman Cutler discovered a large black pig rooting in his garden. The pig was digging up and eating his potatoes, a valuable crop for the isolated settler. This was not the first time the pig had invaded Cutler's garden. Frustrated by the repeated intrusions, Cutler shot and killed the animal. Unfortunately, this was no ordinary pig. It belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irish employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, who served as the manager of the British sheep ranch. When Griffin learned that Cutler had killed his pig, he was furious. The pig was apparently a prized Berkshire boar, and Griffin demanded compensation of $100, a substantial sum at the time. Cutler acknowledged shooting the pig, but considered the requested compensation excessive. He offered $10 instead, arguing that the pig had been trespassing and damaging his crops. Griffin refused this offer and reportedly threatened to have Cutler arrested and taken to Victoria, the British colonial capital on Vancouver Island, to face trial. This threat alarmed Cutler and the other American settlers on the island. They feared that Griffin would make good on his threat and that American citizens would be subjected to British law. A delegation of Americans sought protection from the United States government, petitioning Brigadier General William S. Harney, the commander of the Department of Oregon. General Harney, known for his anti-British sentiments, responded decisively. In July, he dispatched a company of 66 soldiers from the 9th Infantry to San Juan Island under the command of Captain George Pickett, who would later achieve greater fame during the American Civil War at the Battle of Gettysburg. Pickett's orders were to establish a military post and protect American citizens from British authorities. Captain Pickett's arrival dramatically escalated the situation. He proclaimed American sovereignty over the island and warned that any attempt by British authorities to exercise jurisdiction would be resisted. The British responded by sending 3 warships under the command of Captain Geoffrey Hornby to the waters off San Juan Island. The scene was now set for potential conflict. American soldiers faced British warships across a narrow stretch of water, all because of a dispute over a dead pig and unclear treaty language. As tensions escalated, the British naval presence grew to 5 warships, mounting 70 cannon. Governor James Douglas of British Columbia prepared to land Marines on the island to arrest Cutler, the pig killer. Fortunately, cooler heads would eventually prevail. When news of the standoff reached Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan was alarmed at the prospect of war with Great Britain over such a minor incident. He dispatched General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the United States Army, to negotiate a resolution. General Scott, despite being 73 years old and suffering from gout so severe he could barely walk, traveled for 32 days from New York to reach the Pacific Northwest. Upon his arrival in October, he began negotiations with Governor Douglas. Scott had extensive diplomatic experience, having successfully resolved several border disputes between the United States and Britain in the past. Scott and Douglas reached an agreement that both nations would maintain a minimal military presence on the island until the boundary dispute could be resolved through diplomatic channels. The Americans would keep a company of soldiers at one end of the island, while the British would station a small detachment of Royal Marines at the other. This arrangement, known as the Joint Military Occupation, would continue for many years. The final resolution of the boundary dispute would not come until 1872, when Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, acting as an international arbitrator, ruled in favor of the American position. The San Juan Islands became United States territory, and the British garrison departed, ending the joint occupation. Despite the military standoff, the Pig War was remarkable for the fact that the only casualty was the pig itself. No shots were fired in anger, no blood was shed, except for that of the unfortunate swine, and the dispute was ultimately resolved through peaceful diplomacy rather than warfare. The story of the Pig War contains elements that would be comical if they weren't so potentially serious. The death of a single farm animal nearly precipitated armed conflict between two major world powers. Small incidents, a pig rooting for potatoes, an excessive demand for compensation, a threat of arrest, escalated step by step into an international crisis. Yet there are also elements that speak to the maturity of international relations in this period. Despite the initial overreaction on both sides, diplomacy ultimately prevailed. The joint occupation arrangement demonstrated that rival powers could coexist peacefully, even in a disputed territory, while negotiations continued. The willingness to submit the dispute to international arbitration showed a respect for rules-based resolution of conflicts. The Pig War also illustrates how local incidents can become entangled with larger geopolitical issues. The pig was merely the spark that ignited existing tensions over territorial sovereignty. The unclear language in the Oregon Treaty had created an ambiguity that needed resolution. In this context, the pig's death provided a catalyst for addressing the underlying dispute. We might also reflect on the role of individual personalities in shaping historical events. General Harney's anti-British sentiments and impulsive decision to send troops could have led to war. Captain Hornby's restraint in not firing on the American forces despite having superior firepower helped prevent bloodshed. General Scott's diplomatic skills and Governor Douglas's willingness to compromise allowed for a peaceful resolution. And what of the original participants in the dispute? History records that Lyman Cutler, the pig shooter, was never prosecuted. He continued to farm on San Juan Island for several years before moving to Oregon. Charles Griffin, the pig's owner, remained on the island as part of the Hudson's Bay operation until British forces withdrew, after which he too departed. As for the pig itself, the sole casualty of the Pig War, its remains were apparently buried without ceremony, and the exact location of its grave has been lost to history. Yet in its own way, this anonymous pig has achieved a kind of immortality as the central figure in one of history's most unusual international incidents. Today, San Juan Island is a peaceful tourist destination, with both the American and British camps preserved as part of the San Juan Island National Historical Park. Visitors can explore the sites where soldiers and Marines once stood ready for battle in a war that never quite happened, all because of a pig that wandered into the wrong garden. In our next chapter, we will travel to West Africa to explore how British colonial authorities and a proud African kingdom came into conflict over a sacred symbol, the Golden Stool of the Ashanti people. But for now, let thoughts of international boundaries, diplomatic negotiations, and wandering pigs gradually fade into the gentle mists of approaching sleep. From a dispute over a wandering pig, we now turn to a conflict triggered by a ceremonial stool. This story takes us to West Africa at the turn of the 20th century, when European colonial powers were extending their control over the continent, often with little regard for local customs, traditions, or systems of governance. The Ashanti Empire, located in what is now Ghana, was one of Africa's most powerful and sophisticated states. For centuries, the Ashanti had maintained a complex political system centered around their king, known as the Asantehene, who ruled from the capital city of Kumasi. The empire had a well organized military, an extensive trading network, and a rich cultural tradition that included remarkable achievements in art, particularly gold work. Central to Ashanti political and spiritual life was a sacred object known as the Golden Stool, or Sika Dwa. According to Ashanti tradition, this stool had descended from the heavens in the late 17th century, summoned by the great priest Okomfo Anokie during the reign of Asantehene Ose Tutu I. The golden stool was not merely a piece of royal furniture, it was believed to contain the soul or spirit of the Ashanti nation. It was so sacred that not even the king was permitted to sit on it. Instead, it was placed next to him during official functions. The stool was crafted from wood but covered with gold plates. It stood about 18 inches high and was about 2 feet long, curving inward at the middle. Its symbolic importance far outweighed its material value. For the Ashanti, the golden stool represented their sovereignty, unity, and spiritual power. It had never been captured during wars with neighboring African states, and it was carefully hidden during times of conflict. By the late 19th century, the Ashanti Empire had been engaged in a series of wars with the British, who were expanding their colonial territories in West Africa. After decades of conflict, the British finally defeated the Ashanti military in 1896 and exiled King Prempeh Femerstood to Seychelles. They declared the Ashanti territories a British protectorate, but did not formally annex them into their Gold Coast colony. The situation remained tense, with the Ashanti people deeply resentful of British interference in their affairs. The British administration was aware of the Golden Stool's importance, but failed to fully comprehend its profound spiritual and political significance to the Ashanti people. This brings us to the year 1900, when Sir Frederick Mitchell Hodgson, the British governor of the Gold Coast, made a fateful visit to Kumasi. On March 28th, he called a meeting of the remaining Ashanti leadership. In this gathering, he made a demand that would trigger one of the strangest conflicts in colonial history. Standing before the assembled Ashanti chiefs, Hodgson delivered a speech that demonstrated a profound cultural insensitivity and misunderstanding. He declared that since he was now the representative of the paramount power, he should sit upon the golden stool. His words, recorded for posterity, reveal his complete failure to grasp the stool's sacred nature. Where is the golden stool? Why am I not sitting on the golden stool at this moment? I am the representative of the paramount power. Why have you relegated me to this chair? Why did you not take the opportunity of my coming to Kumasi to bring the golden stool and give it to me to sit upon? Hodgson went on to order that the stool be brought to him immediately. He believed that by physically possessing this symbol of Ashanti authority, he would cement British rule. What he failed to understand was that, to the Ashanti, his request was not merely offensive, it was sacrilegious. The assembled chiefs listened in shocked silence. The demand was seen as the ultimate insult to their traditions and identity. No one, not even their own king, sat on the Golden Stool, and now this foreign governor was demanding that right for himself. It was as if Hodgson had demanded to sit on a sacred religious artifact or to desecrate a holy site. One woman in attendance, a senior member of the royal family named Ya Asantewa, was particularly outraged. After the meeting, she addressed the Ashanti leaders, chastising the men for their failure to take immediate action against this insult. In a speech that would become famous, she reportedly declared, "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, so then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." Inspired by Ya Asantewa's courage, the Ashanti resolved to protect their sacred stool at all costs. They hid it even more securely and prepared for armed resistance against the British. Thus began what would become known as the War of the Golden Stool, or the Ya Asantewa War. The conflict began when British forces, on Hodgson's orders, began searching Ashanti villages for the stool. These searches were often conducted aggressively, with little respect for local customs or property. The Ashanti people, under the leadership of Ya Asantewa, responded with armed resistance. They besieged the British fort in Kumasi, where Hodgson and other officials had taken refuge. The siege lasted for several months, from April to late July 1900. The British defenders found themselves in a desperate situation, running low on food and ammunition. Disease spread among those sheltered in the fort, further weakening their position. Meanwhile, Ashanti forces controlled the surrounding countryside, attacking British patrols and supply lines. Eventually, a British relief force fought its way through to Kumasi and rescued Hodgson and the other besieged officials. But the conflict continued in the form of guerrilla warfare, with Ashanti fighters conducting raids against British positions and then disappearing into the forests. The war lasted until January 1901, when British reinforcements finally managed to suppress the rebellion. Ya Asantewa and other leaders were captured and exiled to Seychelles, where she died 20 years later. The British formally annexed the Ashanti Empire into their Gold Coast colony, ending its existence as an independent state. Despite their military victory, the British never did obtain the Golden Stool. The Ashanti had hidden it so effectively that it remained undiscovered. It wasn't until 1921 that the stool briefly came to light when some Ashanti men found it while digging for gold. They removed some of the gold ornaments from it, leading to their arrest by colonial authorities. However, the British, having learned from Hodgson's mistake, now recognized the stool's cultural importance and returned it to the Ashanti royal family with appropriate ceremony. The Golden Stool remains a revered symbol in Ghana today. It is still used in important ceremonial functions, though it is rarely displayed publicly. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, the stool remained with the Ashanti people rather than becoming a national symbol, reflecting its specific cultural and historical significance. The War of the Golden Stool illustrates the profound cultural misunderstandings that characterized many colonial encounters. Governor Hodgson, viewing the stool through European eyes, saw it merely as a throne, a symbol of political authority that should naturally pass to the new ruling power. he failed to comprehend its spiritual dimension and its fundamental connection to Ashanti identity. This conflict also demonstrates how seemingly minor incidents can ignite broader resistance when they touch on deeply held cultural values. The Ashanti, already resentful of British rule, found in Hodgson's demand a clear example of colonial disrespect that crystallized their grievances and galvanized their resistance. The role of Ya Asantewa in this conflict is particularly noteworthy. In a society where military leadership was traditionally male, she emerged as a powerful symbol of resistance, challenging gender norms as well as colonial rule. Her courage and determination inspired not only her contemporaries, but generations that followed. Today, she is celebrated as a national hero in Ghana, a symbol of resistance to colonialism and of female leadership. As we reflect on this unusual conflict, we might consider how objects can become imbued with profound cultural significance that transcends their material value. For the Ashanti, the Golden Stool was not merely a piece of royal regalia, but the embodiment of their collective soul. The willingness to go to war over such an object might seem strange to outsiders, but it makes perfect sense when understood within its cultural context. In our next chapter, we will examine how commercial interests and cultural misunderstandings led to another strange conflict, the Opium Wars between Britain and China. But for now, let the image of the Golden Stool, gleaming in its secret hiding place, fade gently from your mind as sleep draws ever closer. From a conflict over a sacred stool, we now turn to perhaps one of the most morally complex and strange wars in history, a series of conflicts fought for the right to sell drugs. The Opium Wars between Great Britain and China in the 19th century stand as a remarkable example of how commercial interests, cultural misunderstandings, and national pride can combine to create truly unusual conflicts. Our story begins in the late 18th century when trade between China and the Western powers was highly restricted. The Qing dynasty, which ruled China from 1644 to 1912, permitted foreign merchants to trade only at the port of Canton, now known as Guangzhou, and under strictly controlled conditions. European traders were forbidden from learning Chinese, making direct contact with ordinary Chinese people, or traveling into the interior of the country. Despite these restrictions, trade flourished because Europeans, particularly the British, had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese goods such as tea, silk, and porcelain. The problem for the British was that China had little interest in European products. This created a significant trade imbalance, with silver flowing out of Britain and into China at an alarming rate. By the early 19th century, the British East India Company had found a solution to this trade imbalance: opium. Grown in British India, particularly Bengal, opium could be sold in China for substantial profits, which could then be used to purchase Chinese goods. There was just one problem: opium was illegal in China. The Qing government had banned opium in 1729 due to its harmful effects on the population. By 1800, the Emperor Jia Qing had issued an edict further strengthening the prohibition on opium imports. However, these bans did little to stop the flourishing illegal trade. British merchants, along with their American and French counterparts, smuggled opium into China with the help of local collaborators. The consequences for Chinese society were severe. Opium addiction spread rapidly, affecting people from all walks of life, from wealthy merchants to government officials, soldiers, and peasants. Silver began flowing out of China to pay for the drug, creating economic problems. Productivity declined as addiction rates rose. By 1835, it is estimated that there were between 4 and 12 million opium addicts in China. The Chinese government grew increasingly alarmed at this situation. In 1839, the Emperor Dao Guang appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with the mission of ending the opium trade. Lin was a capable and moral official who took his task seriously. He began by writing a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria of Great Britain, though there is no evidence it ever reached her, pointing out the moral hypocrisy of the British position. Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly your honorable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused. When polite diplomacy failed, Lin took more direct action. He confiscated and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium from foreign merchants in Canton, more than 1,000 tons of the drug, without offering compensation. He ordered the merchants to sign bonds promising never to smuggle opium again, on pain of death. The British merchants, led by the Chief Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, were outraged by these actions. They withdrew from Canton to the island of Hong Kong and appealed to the British government for military intervention. The British government, influenced by commercial interests and national pride, responded by sending an expeditionary force to China. Thus began the First Opium War, 1840 to 1842, a conflict that seems almost surreal in its moral dimensions. A war fought, in essence, for the right to sell a dangerous narcotic to a population already suffering from widespread addiction. The military conflict was decidedly one-sided. British warships, with their superior technology, easily outmatched Chinese junks. British soldiers, better equipped and trained, defeated Chinese forces in virtually every engagement. The Chinese, who had long considered themselves the center of civilization and viewed foreigners as barbarians, were shocked by the effectiveness of British military technology. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, China's first unequal treaty with a Western power. Its terms were harsh. China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars in compensation, cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to foreign trade, and grant extraterritoriality to British subjects, meaning they would be subject to British rather than Chinese law. Remarkably, the treaty did not explicitly mention opium. The drug trade continued, now operating with even less interference from Chinese authorities. Despite their military victory, the British wanted to maintain the fiction that they had not gone to war for the sake of selling opium. Nevertheless, everyone understood the reality of the situation. Britain had fought and won a war for the right to continue a profitable drug trade. But the story does not end there. Relations between China and Britain remained tense in the years following the First Opium War. The Chinese resented the terms of the Treaty of Nanking and were reluctant to implement them fully. The British, for their part, sought to expand their trading privileges and access to Chinese markets. In 1856, a seemingly minor incident triggered a second conflict. Chinese authorities boarded a ship called the Arrow, which was registered in Hong Kong but manned by Chinese sailors and arrested several crew members on suspicion of piracy. The British claimed this violated their flag and demanded an apology and the release of the prisoners. When these demands were not met to their satisfaction, British forces attacked Canton. This marked the beginning of the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, which would eventually involve French forces as well. Once again, Western military superiority proved decisive. British and French troops captured Canton, took the Taku forts that guarded the approach to Beijing, and eventually occupied the Chinese capital itself. In one of the most notorious episodes of this conflict, British and French forces looted and then burned the Old Summer Palace, Yuan, a complex of palaces and gardens outside Beijing that represented the height of Chinese imperial architecture and contained countless artistic treasures. This act of cultural vandalism was ordered by Lord Elgin, son of the man who removed the Parthenon marbles from Athens, as punishment for the torture and execution of Western prisoners. The Second Opium War ended with the Convention of Peking in 1860. China was forced to accept even more onerous terms: the opening of 11 more ports to foreign trade, the legalization of opium, the cession of Kowloon, adjacent to Hong Kong, to Britain, permission for foreigners to travel in the interior of China, and the right for Christian missionaries to proselytize. The Opium Wars represent a strange and troubling chapter in the history of international relations. They demonstrate how economic interests can override moral considerations, how military power can be used to force unequal trading relationships, and how cultural misunderstandings can exacerbate conflicts. From the British perspective at the time, the wars were about free trade, treaty rights, and national honor. The fact that the trade in question involved an addictive narcotic was considered secondary. The British government and merchants convinced themselves they were merely meeting a demand that already existed. From the Chinese perspective, the wars represented a humiliating violation of sovereignty and a moral outrage. A foreign power was using military force to compel China to accept a trade that was poisoning its people and draining its economy. The resulting century of humiliation would profoundly shape Chinese nationalism and continue to influence China's relations with the West to this day. Perhaps most strangely, these wars represent a complete inversion of what we might expect in a drug-related conflict. Today, we are accustomed to hearing about wars against drugs, where military force is used to stop narcotic trafficking. The Opium Wars, by contrast, were wars for drugs, conflicts fought to protect and expand the drug trade. The legacy of the Opium Wars was long-lasting and far-reaching. For China, they marked the beginning of a period of foreign intervention, internal rebellion, and eventual collapse of the imperial system. For Britain, they secured commercial advantages in East Asia, but at a significant moral cost. The seizure of Hong Kong created a colony that would not be returned to Chinese control until 1997. More broadly, the Opium Wars exemplify the complex and often contradictory nature of imperialism in the 19th century. Commercial interests, national pride, cultural superiority, and military power combined to create a system where Western powers could impose their will on non-Western societies while maintaining a belief in their own moral righteousness. As we reflect on this strange chapter in history, we might consider how economic interests can distort moral judgments, how power imbalances can shape international relations, and how the narratives nations tell themselves about their actions may diverge dramatically from how those actions are perceived by others. In our next chapter, we will explore a conflict that began with a simple border crossing by a shepherd pursuing his dog, the War of the Stray Dog between Greece and Bulgaria. But for now, let the complex moral questions raised by the Opium Wars gradually recede as more peaceful thoughts guide you toward tranquil rest. From the morally complex Opium Wars, we now turn to a conflict that began with a simple misadventure involving a shepherd and his dog. This curious episode occurred in 1925 between Greece and Bulgaria, two Balkan neighbors with a history of tense relations and territorial disputes. The aftermath of the First World War had left the Balkans in a precarious state. The old Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires had collapsed, new nations had emerged, and borders had been redrawn, often with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities on the ground. These changes created tensions that would simmer for decades, occasionally erupting into open conflict. Greece and Bulgaria had already fought against each other in the Second Balkan War of 1913 and on opposite sides during the First World War. Their shared border, running through the rugged mountains of the southern Balkans, was a sensitive region marked by occasional skirmishes and vigilant military patrols. It was in this tense context that a seemingly trivial incident occurred on October the 19th, 1925. A Greek soldier named Ioannis Petrov was patrolling near the Bulgarian border with his dog. According to some accounts, the dog was chasing a rabbit. According to others, it was simply wandering ahead of its master. Regardless of the reason, the dog crossed into Bulgarian territory. Petrov, concerned about losing his canine companion, followed the dog across the border. This unauthorized border crossing was observed by Bulgarian sentries, who immediately opened fire. Petrov was killed in the ensuing exchange of gunfire. News of the incident quickly reached Greek military authorities, who were outraged at what they perceived as a disproportionate response to an accidental border crossing. The Greek government demanded an apology and compensation from Bulgaria. When these demands were not immediately met, the situation escalated rapidly. On October 22nd, just 3 days after the initial incident, Greek forces received orders to occupy the Bulgarian town of Petric, located near the border. Greek troops crossed into Bulgarian territory and began shelling the town, causing civilian casualties and significant damage. The Bulgarian government, faced with this sudden invasion, appealed to the League of Nations, the intergovernmental organization established after the First World War to maintain international peace and security. This was one of the earliest tests of the League's ability to resolve conflicts between member states. Meanwhile, the Greek army continued its advance into Bulgarian territory. By some accounts, up to 10,000 Greek soldiers were involved in the operation. The Bulgarians, whose military had been severely limited by the Treaty of Neuilly following the First World War, were in no position to mount an effective defense. Instead, they mobilized a force of civilians to resist the Greek invasion. The League of Nations responded with remarkable speed to Bulgaria's appeal. On October 24th, the Council of the League demanded an immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of Greek forces from Bulgarian territory. The Council also established a commission to investigate the incident and determine appropriate compensation. Under international pressure, the Greek government ordered its forces to halt their advance and begin withdrawing on October 28th. The entire conflict had lasted less than 10 days, but it had resulted in at least 50 deaths, mostly Bulgarian civilians, and significant property damage. The League of Nations Commission conducted a thorough investigation of the incident, interviewing witnesses and examining the disputed border area. In its final report, issued in December 1925, the Commission largely found in favor of Bulgaria. It concluded that the Greek invasion had been unjustified and disproportionate to the initial incident. The League ordered Greece to pay Bulgaria compensation of £45,000 sterling, a considerable sum at the time. This compensation was to cover the damages caused during the brief occupation and the civilian casualties. Greece was also formally censured for its violation of Bulgarian sovereignty. This obscure conflict, sometimes called the War of the Stray Dog or the incident at Petric, might seem like a mere footnote in history, especially when compared to the great wars of the 20th century. Yet it merits attention for several reasons. First, it demonstrates how seemingly trivial incidents can trigger significant international crises when they occur in the context of pre-existing tensions. The death of a single soldier pursuing his dog would not normally lead to a military invasion, but in the volatile Balkans of the 1920s, it provided a spark for underlying animosities to flare into open conflict. Second, the incident represents one of the few clear successes of the League of Nations in resolving international disputes. The League's swift and decisive response helped prevent what could have escalated into a much larger regional conflict. This was particularly notable given the League's later failures to prevent aggression in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and ultimately Europe itself, which would lead to the Second World War. Third, the conflict illustrates the challenges of maintaining stable international borders, particularly in regions with complex ethnic, historical, and territorial claims. The Greek-Bulgarian border, like many in the Balkans, cut through communities with shared cultural and economic ties. Local populations often did not respect these artificial boundaries in their daily lives, creating situations ripe for misunderstandings and confrontations. The role of the dog in this story adds an element of tragicomedy that has kept the incident alive in historical memory. The fate of the canine that unwittingly triggered an international crisis is not recorded in official documents. We do not know if it returned to Greek territory, remained in Bulgaria, or fell victim to the gunfire that killed its master. Like many innocent bystanders in conflicts throughout history, the dog's story is lost to us. For the people living in the border region, however, the consequences were all too real. The town of Petric suffered significant damage from Greek artillery, and families lost loved ones in a conflict that in retrospect seems entirely avoidable. The compensation ordered by the League of Nations, while symbolically important, could never fully address these human costs. In the larger historical context, the War of the Stray Dog represents a moment when international institutions worked as intended. The League of Nations, often remembered for its failures rather than its successes, managed in this case to de-escalate a conflict, hold an aggressor accountable, and provide a measure of justice for the victim of aggression. This success was unfortunately not repeated often enough in the interwar period. The Greek-Bulgarian border remained a sensitive area in the years that followed, though relations between the two countries gradually improved. During the Second World War, Bulgaria occupied portions of Greek Macedonia and Thrace with the support of Nazi Germany, reopening old wounds. After the war, both countries found themselves on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, with Bulgaria becoming a Soviet satellite and Greece remaining in the Western sphere. Today, Greece and Bulgaria are both members of the European Union and NATO, and their border is open under the Schengen Agreement. Citizens can cross freely, and trade flows unhindered. The days when a dog straying across the frontier could trigger an international conflict seem like distant history. Yet the fundamental issues that underlay the War of the Stray Dog remain relevant to international relations today. How should states respond to border violations? What constitutes a proportionate response to provocation? How can international organizations effectively mediate between conflicting parties? These questions continue to challenge diplomats and political leaders around the world. As we reflect on this curious chapter in history, we might consider how easily minor incidents can escalate when filtered through the lens of national pride and security concerns. The death of a soldier pursuing his dog across a border may seem like an absurd reason for war, but it reminds us that conflict often arises not from grand strategies or vital interests, but from the unpredictable interactions of individuals caught in larger geopolitical tensions. In our next chapter, we will explore an even more unusual conflict, a war that allegedly began over a dispute about a marzipan cake. But for now, let the image of a faithful dog, unaware of human borders and the consequences of crossing them, guide your thoughts toward peaceful slumber. From border disputes triggered by wandering dogs, we now turn to perhaps one of the most peculiar and least known conflicts in European history, a diplomatic crisis that centered around a dessert. The story of the Marzipan Cake War, or as it is sometimes called, the Monaco-Esperanza conflict, demonstrates how seemingly trivial matters of etiquette and honor could escalate into serious diplomatic incidents in the intricate world of 19th century European court politics. Our story takes place in the mid-19th century, during a period when Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and small independent states. Monaco, a tiny principality on the Mediterranean coast, was already established as a sovereign entity, ruled by the Grimaldi family since the 13th century. By contrast, the Duchy of Esperanza was a small but proud Germanic state, one of the many semi-autonomous entities within the loose confederation that existed before German unification. The relations between these two minor European powers had traditionally been cordial, if somewhat distant due to geography. Neither posed any military threat to the other, and their diplomatic interactions were limited to occasional formal exchanges and participation in broader European congresses. The incident that would lead to the so-called Marzipan Cake War began in 1842 at a diplomatic reception in Vienna. The ruling Prince of Monaco, Honoré V, was celebrating his birthday, and among the many gifts and gestures of goodwill he received was an elaborately decorated marzipan cake from the Duke of Esperanza, Friedrich Wilhelm IV. Marzipan, a confection made from ground almonds and sugar, was highly prized in 19th century Europe. It was often shaped and colored to create edible works of art, particularly for aristocratic occasions. The cake sent by the Duke of Esperanza was reportedly a masterpiece of confectionery, depicting the coat of arms of Monaco in precise detail, surrounded by delicate marzipan sculptures representing the prosperity and cultural achievements of the principality. However, when the cake was cut during the celebration, it was discovered that beneath its beautiful exterior, the cake had spoiled. Whether due to the long journey from Esperanza to Vienna or some problem in its preparation, the interior had developed mold and emitted an unpleasant odor when sliced open. The Prince of Monaco, embarrassed before his distinguished guests, interpreted this as a deliberate insult. In the complex code of aristocratic honor that governed relations between European rulers, such an affront could not be ignored. He immediately instructed his diplomatic representative to deliver a formal protest to the Duke of Esperanza demanding an apology. The Duke, upon receiving this protest, was bewildered and then outraged. From his perspective, he had sent a magnificent gift as a gesture of goodwill, sparing no expense in its creation. The fact that it had spoiled in transit was unfortunate, but certainly not intentional. Moreover, he felt that the Prince of Monaco had insulted him by publicly implying that he would deliberately send a rotten cake as a birthday gift. The Duke therefore refused to apologize, and instead demanded that the Prince of Monaco retract his accusation. Thus began a cycle of increasingly hostile diplomatic exchanges. The Prince of Monaco recalled his envoy from the court of Esperanza. The Duke responded by expelling Monaco's honorary consul from his territories. Trade relations, though limited, were suspended. The conflict might have remained at this level of diplomatic posturing had it not been for an unfortunate escalation involving another dessert. Several months after the initial incident, at a European diplomatic congress in Frankfurt, representatives of both Monaco and Esperanza were present. During a formal dinner, the Esperanzan diplomat was served a simple almond pastry. Taking this as a deliberate reference to the spoiled marzipan cake and thus another insult, he threw the pastry to the floor and stormed out of the gathering. Nevertheless, the core elements of the story, a diplomatic gift gone wrong, escalating misunderstandings, wounded pride, and eventual resolution through careful mediation, reflect very real dynamics in historical diplomatic relations. They remind us that international conflicts often have less to do with substantial matters of state than with perceptions, honor, and saving face. The Marzipan Cake War also illustrates how seemingly minor incidents can take on greater significance when they occur against a backdrop of complex international relationships and power dynamics. In the tense environment of 19th century Europe, where states were constantly jockeying for position and influence, even a spoiled dessert could become a matter of national importance. As we reflect on this peculiar episode, we might consider our own experiences with misunderstandings that escalate beyond their original significance, and how pride can sometimes stand in the way of simple resolutions. We might also appreciate the role of skilled mediators like Metternich, who help conflicting parties find face-saving compromises that allow everyone to step back from the brink of more serious confrontation. In our next chapter, we will travel to the jungles of New Guinea to explore a conflict that erupted over the death of a sacred bird, the Cassowary War between tribal communities. But for now, let thoughts of diplomatic tensions and marzipan confections fade away as you drift deeper into tranquil rest. From the refined courts of 19th century Europe and disputes over marzipan cakes, we now journey to the lush tropical forests of New Guinea, where a different kind of conflict arose from the death of a remarkable bird. This story takes us into a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were fluid, where animals held profound symbolic and spiritual significance, and where the death of a single bird could ignite an intertribal war. New Guinea, the second largest island in the world, is a place of extraordinary biological and cultural diversity. Its rugged terrain of mountains, valleys, and dense forests created natural barriers that fostered the development of hundreds of distinct cultures and languages. In the early 20th century, when our story takes place, many parts of the island remained largely untouched by outside influences, with indigenous communities maintaining traditional ways of life that had evolved over thousands of years. Among the many remarkable creatures that inhabit New Guinea's forests is the cassowary, a flightless bird related to emus and ostriches. Standing up to 6 feet tall, with vibrant blue and red neck wattles, a distinctive casque or helmet on its head, and powerful legs equipped with dagger-like claws, the cassowary is an imposing presence. It is also notoriously temperamental and can be extremely dangerous when threatened, capable of inflicting serious injuries or even death with a single kick. For many indigenous peoples of New Guinea, cassowaries were not merely birds, but beings of great spiritual significance. They were seen as connecting the human world with the realm of spirits and ancestors. In some cultures, cassowaries were believed to be reincarnations of deceased clan members or guardians of sacred knowledge. The bird's feathers, bones, and other parts were used in important ceremonies and as symbols of status and power. Given this cultural context, the hunting or killing of a cassowary was rarely a simple matter. It often involved elaborate rituals and restrictions designed to honor the bird's spirit and prevent supernatural repercussions. In some communities, only certain individuals had the right to hunt cassowaries, and the distribution of meat followed strict protocols based on kinship and social status. It was against this complex cultural backdrop that the incident known as the Cassowary War unfolded in the highlands of New Guinea in the 1930s. According to anthropological accounts, the conflict began when a hunter from one tribal group killed a cassowary that had wandered into their territory from the lands of a neighboring group. This particular cassowary was no ordinary bird. It was recognizable by distinctive markings and behaviors that had led the neighboring tribe to identify it as the embodiment of a recently deceased tribal elder. They had been observing it for some time, noting patterns that confirmed its special status in their cosmology. The killing of this bird was therefore not simply the hunting of an animal, but from their perspective, something akin to the murder of a revered ancestor. When news of the cassowary's death reached the neighboring tribe, there was immediate outrage. Tribal leaders demanded compensation in the form of pigs, shells, and other valuable items that traditionally served as currency in intertribal exchanges. They also insisted on the right to perform specific funeral rituals over the remains of the bird to ensure the proper passage of the elder's spirit. The hunter's tribe, however, rejected these demands. From their perspective, they had simply killed a wild bird that had entered their hunting grounds, well within their traditional rights. They did not share the belief that this particular cassowary embodied the spirit of the neighboring tribe's elder. Moreover, they had already consumed the bird and distributed its parts according to their own customs, making it impossible to return the remains. This impasse quickly escalated into a broader conflict that engaged multiple clans and communities allied with each of the principal tribes. What might have remained a localized dispute became a regional conflict involving several hundred warriors. Fighting occurred sporadically over a period of many months, with ambushes, raids, and occasional larger scale confrontations. Traditional weapons such as spears, bows and arrows, and clubs were used in the conflict. While precise casualty figures were never documented by outside observers, oral histories suggest that dozens of warriors were killed and many more wounded. Beyond the human toll, gardens were destroyed, houses burned, and sacred sites desecrated, causing significant disruption to community life throughout the region. The conflict might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the intervention of two significant forces. The first was a group of tribal elders from communities not directly involved in the fighting. These respected neutral figures began a process of mediation, drawing on traditional conflict resolution practices that had evolved over centuries to manage disputes in a region where warfare was a recurring feature of intertribal relations. The second intervening force was environmental. A prolonged drought affected the region, threatening food security for all communities, regardless of their allegiance in the conflict. Faced with a common threat to survival, the warring parties became more receptive to negotiation. After several failed attempts, a peace ceremony was finally arranged at a neutral location. The ceremony involved elaborate exchanges of compensation, with pigs, shells, feathers, and other valuable items changing hands to acknowledge the harms inflicted during the conflict. Perhaps most importantly, both sides participated in spiritual rituals designed to appease the ancestors, including the spirit of the deceased elder believed to have inhabited the cassowary. The settlement included an agreement about hunting rights and protocols for addressing similar situations in the future. Both communities recognized that certain animals might be spiritually significant to their neighbors and established a system for verifying such claims and providing appropriate compensation when necessary. The Cassowary War, while unknown to most outside of anthropological circles, provides a fascinating window into how fundamentally different worldviews can lead to conflict. For Western observers, a dispute over a bird might seem trivial or even absurd. But seen through the lens of New Guinea highland cultures, where the boundaries between humans, animals, and spirits were permeable, and where ancestors remained active participants in community affairs, the conflict was about profound issues of respect, spiritual integrity, and cosmic order. This episode also illustrates how conflicts often occur at the intersection of competing legitimate claims. Both tribes were acting in accordance with their own cultural understandings and values. The hunting tribe was following its traditional practices regarding wildlife in its territory. The neighboring tribe was responding to what it perceived as a spiritual violation and disrespect to an ancestor. Neither was wrong within its own cultural framework. The resolution of the Cassowary War demonstrates the effectiveness of indigenous conflict resolution mechanisms that evolved specifically to address such culturally complex disputes. Rather than imposing a judgment about which side was right, the mediation process focused on restoring relationships and acknowledging the legitimacy of each community's concerns. Compensation served not as punishment, but as recognition of harm and a means of rebalancing social and spiritual equilibrium. In the decades following the Cassowary War, New Guinea experienced significant changes as outside influences increasingly penetrated even remote areas. Christian missionaries challenged traditional spiritual beliefs, colonial administrators imposed new systems of governance, and eventually, formal education and modern technologies transformed many aspects of indigenous life. Today, while many traditional practices and beliefs persist, particularly in remote areas, they coexist with elements of modern global culture. The worldview that made the Cassowary War possible, where birds could embody ancestral spirits and their death could require elaborate compensation, has been altered, though not entirely displaced, by these encounters with outside perspectives. As we reflect on this unusual conflict, we might consider how our own cultural assumptions shape our understanding of what constitutes a reasonable cause for dispute. The Cassowary War reminds us that what appears strange or trivial from one cultural perspective may be profound and essential from another. In our final chapter, we will explore how a seemingly minor incident involving the theft of a camel escalated into a bloody conflict in North Africa, in what became known as the Camel War. But for now, let the image of the magnificent cassowary, with its brilliant blue neck and prehistoric appearance, fade gently from your mind as you continue your journey toward peaceful slumber. In our final chapter exploring history's strangest conflicts, we turn to the sun-baked deserts of North Africa, where a dispute over a single camel escalated into a bloody conflict that would claim hundreds of lives. This episode, known as the Camel War or the War of the Stray Camel, illustrates how in societies where honor and tribal loyalty are paramount, even minor incidents can trigger devastating cycles of violence. Our story takes place in the late 19th century in the vast desert region that stretches across what is now southern Egypt, northern Sudan, and parts of Chad and Libya. This harsh landscape was home to various nomadic tribes who had adapted to the extreme conditions of desert life. For these peoples, camels were far more than mere beasts of burden. They were essential to survival, providing transportation, milk, meat, and hides. A tribe's camel herd represented both its wealth and its ability to navigate the unforgiving desert environment. The exact date of the incident that triggered the Camel War varies in different historical accounts, but most place it around 1887. It began when a valuable racing camel belonging to the Abu Saif tribe went missing. Racing camels were particularly prized possessions, often worth more than several dozen ordinary camels due to their speed and prestige. They were carefully bred and trained and represented significant status for their owners. After searching for several days, members of the Abu Saif tribe found their missing camel in the possessions of a young man from the neighboring Al-Fajr tribe. The young man claimed he had found the camel wandering alone in the desert and had taken it in, intending to discover its rightful owner. The Abu Saif tribesmen, however, accused him of theft, a serious crime in a society where survival often depended on respect for property, particularly when that property was as valuable as a racing camel. The situation might have been resolved peacefully through traditional mediation, with the camel returned and perhaps some compensation paid to acknowledge the care the young man had provided. However, the confrontation quickly turned violent. Tempers flared, and in the ensuing struggle, the young man from the Al Fajr tribe was killed. This death transformed what might have remained a simple dispute over property into a matter of blood honor. In the tribal society of the region, the concept of blood revenge, the obligation to avenge the killing of a family or tribal member, was deeply ingrained. The Al Fajr tribe now demanded compensation for the death of their kinsman in the form of blood money dia traditionally paid to the family of someone killed unintentionally. The Abu Saif tribe, however, refused to pay, claiming that the death had occurred in a legitimate dispute over stolen property. This refusal was seen by the Al Fajr as a grave insult, compounding the original offense. According to the code of honor that governed tribal relations, they now had no choice but to seek revenge directly. A group of Al Fajr warriors attacked an Abu Saif encampment, killing several men and stealing a number of camels in retaliation. The Abu Saif, now themselves obligated to avenge their dead, mounted a counter-raid. Thus began a cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that would continue for several years, drawing in related tribes and clans allied with each of the principal parties. What had begun as a dispute over a single camel expanded into a regional conflict involving thousands of tribesmen across a vast desert area. Raids and counter-raids multiplied, with tactics growing increasingly brutal as the conflict progressed. Wells were poisoned, livestock slaughtered, and women and children were not always spared in the violence. Trade routes became unsafe, and the ordinary patterns of nomadic life were severely disrupted. The British authorities, who exercised nominal control over much of the region through their administration of Egypt and Sudan, initially paid little attention to what they viewed as typical tribal skirmishing. It was only when the conflict began to threaten broader regional stability and commerce that they took notice. British officials attempted to mediate, but their limited understanding of tribal customs and relationships hampered these efforts. More effective were the interventions of respected religious leaders from outside the immediate conflict zone. Islamic scholars, ulama, and Sufi sheikhs who commanded respect across tribal boundaries worked to broker a peace, drawing on both religious principles and traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. They emphasized Islamic prohibitions against Muslims fighting one another and the concept of collective responsibility for maintaining peace. After nearly 3 years of intermittent but intense fighting, during which an estimated 300 to 500 people were killed, a peace conference was convened. Tribal elders from both sides, along with neutral mediators, gathered to negotiate terms for ending the conflict. The process was long and complex, involving detailed discussions of every death and injury, the value of property destroyed or stolen, and the appropriate compensation for each harm. Eventually, an agreement was reached that included payment of blood money for each person killed, with the amounts carefully calibrated based on age, gender, and status, return of stolen livestock, or equivalent compensation. Collective oaths sworn on the Quran to abide by the peace terms. Marriage alliances between the previously hostile tribes to cement the reconciliation, establishment of a council of elders from both tribes to resolve future disputes before they could escalate the peace held, though tensions between the tribes simmered for generations. The memory of the Camel War was preserved in oral traditions, poetry, and songs that served both to commemorate the violence and to warn against allowing future disputes to spiral out of control. The Camel War illustrates several important aspects of how conflicts begin and evolve. First, it shows how disputes over seemingly minor issues, in this case, a single camel, can escalate when they occur in a context where honor, identity, and survival are closely intertwined. The camel itself was valuable, but the principles at stake, property rights, honesty, and proper behavior between tribes, carried far greater significance. Second, this conflict demonstrates the power of cultural institutions in both creating and resolving conflicts. The same code of honor that demanded blood revenge also provided mechanisms for negotiating peace and restoring harmony. Traditional tribal society contained within itself both the seeds of devastating violence and the tools for reconciliation. Third, the Camel War reflects how conflicts often persist and expand because each party is acting in accordance with what they perceive as legitimate moral principles. Neither the Abu Saif nor the Al-Fajr saw themselves as aggressors. Each believed they were upholding justice and honor according to their shared cultural values. This incident also reminds us that conflict resolution often requires acknowledging the legitimate grievances on all sides rather than simply determining who was right in the original dispute. The peace agreement did not focus on assigning blame for the initial camel incident, but instead sought to address the harms suffered by everyone involved and to restore relationships between communities that needed to coexist in a challenging environment. The desert regions where the Camel War occurred have since experienced profound changes. Colonial boundaries have hardened into modern national borders. Many formerly nomadic peoples have settled in towns and cities. Economic development, education, and technology have transformed traditional ways of life. Yet elements of the tribal code of honor and the practices of conflict resolution that we see in this story continue to influence social relations in the region. As we conclude our journey through these 10 strange conflicts from around the world and throughout history, several common themes emerge. We see how trivial incidents, a stolen bucket, a severed ear, a football match, a wandering pig, a sacred stool, a drug trade, a stray dog, a spoiled cake, a killed bird, or a missing camel can trigger serious conflicts when they occur in contexts of pre-existing tension or touch on matters of deeply held principle. We also observe how the stories that societies tell themselves about conflicts often focus on these triggering incidents rather than the underlying causes, creating narratives that may seem absurd to outsiders but make perfect sense within their cultural context. And we see how, time and again, creative diplomacy, face-saving compromises, and traditional wisdom have found paths to peace, even in seemingly intractable situations. Perhaps most importantly, these unusual conflicts remind us that while the specific causes of war may sometimes appear strange or trivial, the consequences, in human suffering, disrupted lives, and damaged communities, are always serious. They invite us to consider how our own societies might avoid the escalation of minor disputes into major conflicts, and how we might draw on both traditional wisdom and modern institutions to resolve our differences peacefully. As our exploration of history's strangest conflicts comes to an end, may these reflections on human folly and reconciliation guide you toward peaceful dreams, where buckets remain unbattled over, ears remain attached, and camels wander safely through the desert night.